laborers who have been immediately instrumental in the production; that another third is necessary to replace the materials used and the fixed capital worn out in the process; while the remaining third is clear gain, being a profit of 50 per cent. Suppose, for example, that 60 agricultural laborers, receiving 60 quarters of corn for their wages, consume fixed capital and seed amounting to the value of 60 quarters more, and that the result of their operation is a produce of 180 quarters. When we analyze the price of the seed and tools into its elements, we find that they must have been the produce of the labor of 40 men; for the wages of those 40, together with profit at the rate previously supposed, 50 per cent., make up 60 quarters. The produce, therefore, consisting of 180 quarters, is the result of the labor altogether of 100 men, namely, the 60 first mentioned, and the 40 by whose labor the fixed capital and the seed were produced. Let us now suppose, by way of an extreme case, that some contrivance is discovered whereby the purposes to which the second third of the produce had been devoted may be dispensed with altogether; that some means are invented by which the same amount of produce may be procured without the assistance of any fixed capital, or the consumption of any seed or material sufficiently valuable to be worth calculating. Let us, however, suppose that this cannot be done without taking on a number of additional laborers, equal to those required for producing the seed and fixed capital, so that the saving shall be only in the profits of the previous capitalist. Let us, in conformity with this supposition, assume that in dispensing with the fixed capital and seed, value 60 quarters, it is necessary to take on 40 additional laborers, receiving a quarter of corn each, as before. The rate of profit has inevitably risen. It has increased from 50 per cent. to 60 per cent. A return of 180 quarters would not before be obtained but by an outlay of 120 quarters. It can now be obtained by an outlay of no more than 100. Here, therefore, is an undeniable rise of profits. Have wages, in the sense above attached to them, fallen or not? It would seem not. The produce, 180 quarters, is still the result of the same quantity of labor as before, namely, the labor of 100 men. A quarter of corn, therefore, is still as before the produce of 10/18 of a man's labor for a year. Each laborer receives, as before, 1/4 of corn. Each there receives the produce of 10/18 of a year's labor of one man. That is the same cost of production. Each receives 10/18 of the produce of his own labor. That is the same proportional wages. And the laborers collectively still receive the same proportion, namely 10/18 of the whole produce. The conclusion, then, cannot be resisted, that Mr. Ricardo's theory is defective, at the rate of profits does not exclusively depend upon the value of wages, in his sense, namely, the quantity of labor of which the wages of a laborer are the produce; that it does not exclusively depend upon proportional wages, that is, upon the proportion which the laborers collectively receive of the whole produce, or the ratio which the wages of an individual laborer bear to the produce of his individual labor. Those political economists, therefore, who have always dissented from Mr. Ricardo's doctrine, or who, having at first admitted, ended by discarding it, were so far in the right, but they committed a serious error in this, that, with the usual one-sidedness of disputants, they knew no medium between admitting absolutely and dismissing entirely, and saw no other course than utterly to reject what it would have been sufficient to modify. It is remarkable how very slight a modification will suffice to render Mr. Ricardo's doctrine completely true. It is even doubtful whether he himself, if called upon to adapt his expressions to this particular case, would not have so explained his doctrine as to render it entirely objectionable. It is perfectly true that in the example already made use of, a rise of profits takes place, while wages considered in respect to the quantity of labour of which they are the produce have not varied at all. But though wages are still the produce of the same quantity of labour as before, the cost of production of wages has nevertheless fallen, for into cost of production there enters another element besides labour. We have already remarked, and the very example out of which the difficulty arose presupposes it, that the cost of production of an article consists generally of two parts: the wages of the labour employed, and the profits of those who, in any antecedent stage of the production, have advanced any portion of those wages. An article, therefore, may be the produce of the same quantity of labour as before, and yet, if any portion of the profits which the last producer has to make good to previous producers can be economized, the cost of production of the article is diminished. Now, in our example, a diminution of this sort is supposed to have taken place in the cost of production of corn. The production of that article has become less costly in the ratio of 6 to 5. A quantity of corn, the means of producing which could not previously have been secured but at an expense of 120 quarters, can now be produced by means which 100 quarters are sufficient to purchase. But the labourer is supposed to receive the same quantity of corn as before. He receives 1 quarter. The cost of production of wages has therefore fallen 1/6. A quarter of corn, which is the remuneration of a single labourer, is indeed the produce of the same quantity of labour as before, but its cost of production is nevertheless diminished. It is now the produce of 10/18 of a man's labour, and nothing else, whereas formerly it required for its production the conjunction of that quarter of labour with an expenditure in the form of reimbursement profit amounting to 1/5 more. If the cost of production of wages had remained the same as before, profits could not have risen. Each labourer received 1 quarter of corn, but 1 quarter of corn at that time was the result of the same cost of production as 1 1/5 quarter now. In order, therefore, that the labourer should receive the same cost of production, each must now receive 1 quarter of corn plus 1/5. The labour of 100 men could not be purchased at this price for less than 120 quarters, and the produce, 180 quarters, would yield only 50 per cent, as first supposed. It would be easy to go over in the same manner any other case. For instance, if we suppose that, instead of dispensing with the whole of the fixed capital, material, etc., and taking on labourers in equal number to those by whom these were produced, half only of the fixed capital and material is dispensed with, so that instead of 60 labourers at a fixed capital worth 60 quarters of corn, we have 80 labourers with a fixed capital worth 30. The numerical statement of this case is more intricate than that in the text, but the result is not different. It is therefore strictly true that the rate of profits varies inversely as the cost of production of wages. Profits cannot rise unless the cost of production of wages falls exactly as much, nor fall unless it rises. The proof of this proposition has been stated in figures, and in a particular case we shall now state it in general terms for all cases. We have supposed, for simplicity, that wages are paid in the finished commodity. The agricultural labourers in our example were paid in corn, and if we had called them weavers, we should have supposed them to be paid in cloth. The supposition is allowable, for it is obviously of no consequence in a question of value, or cost of production, what precise article we assume as the medium of exchange. The supposition has, besides, the recommendation of being conformable to the most ordinary state of the facts, for it is by the sale of his own finished article that each capitalist obtains the means of hiring labourers to renew the production, which is virtually the same thing as if, instead of selling the article for money and giving the money to his labourers, he gave the article itself to the labourers, and they sold it for their daily bread. Assuming, therefore, that the labourer is paid in the very article that he produces, it is evident that, When any